The fall of the Berlin Wall marked a seismic shift in modern history, forever altering the global landscape. As the Iron Curtain crumbled, millions were freed from the shackles of oppression, paving the way for a new era of freedom and unity. The wall's collapse still echoes through our world today, a powerful reminder that even the most imposing barriers can fall in an instant. In the aftermath of World War II, the world was plunged into a new era of division and tension, as the Allied powers of the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union carved up the defeated Germany into occupied zones. The city of Berlin, once the capital of the Third Reich, found itself at the epicenter of this Cold War struggle, with the Soviet Union controlling the eastern sector and the Western Allies governing the western sectors. As the years passed, the divisions between East and West deepened, with the Soviet Union imposing a communist regime on its occupied territory, while the Western powers encouraged democratic institutions and market economies in theirs. In 1949, the Western zones of occupation were merged to form the Federal Republic of Germany, or West Germany, with its capital in Bonn. The Soviet zone, meanwhile, became the German Democratic Republic, or East Germany, with its capital in East Berlin. The city of Berlin itself remained a point of contention, with the Western powers maintaining a presence in the western sectors and the Soviets controlling the eastern sector. As the years went by, the flow of refugees from East Germany to West Germany grew, with hundreds of thousands of people fleeing the communist regime for the freedom and prosperity of the West. In response to this hemorrhaging of population, the government of East Germany, with the backing of the Soviet Union, began to consider measures to stem the flow of refugees. In 1961, the East German government, led by Walter Ulbricht, decided to take drastic action, constructing a physical barrier to separate East and West Berlin. The Berlin Wall, as it came to be known, was erected overnight on August 13, 1961, with soldiers and police standing guard to prevent anyone from crossing. The wall was a brutal and effective solution, cutting off the flow of refugees and isolating the people of East Germany from the rest of the world. The construction of the Berlin Wall marked a new era of division and repression in Europe, as the Soviet Union tightened its grip on Eastern Europe, and the United States and its allies responded with a policy of containment. The wall itself became a powerful symbol of the Cold War, a physical manifestation of the ideological divide between communism and democracy. For the people of East Germany, the wall was a constant reminder of their confinement, a barrier that separated them from the freedom and opportunity of the West. As the years passed, the Berlin Wall became increasingly sophisticated, with watchtowers, Reichsgraben, and guard dogs designed to prevent anyone from crossing. The wall also became a deadly barrier, with hundreds of people killed or injured while attempting to cross. Despite the risks, many continued to try, using ingenious methods to evade the guards and escape to the West. For those who remained in East Germany, life was marked by scarcity, repression, and fear, as the government exercised total control over every aspect of daily life. As the years went by, the people of East Germany grew increasingly desperate, their lives marked by a pervasive sense of hopelessness and disaffection. The government's efforts to suppress dissent only seemed to fuel the flames of resistance, with underground movements and dissident groups sprouting up in secret. One such group, the Initiative for Peace and Human Rights, emerged in the late 1970s, its members risking arrest and imprisonment to distribute samizdat literature and organize clandestine protests. The group's leaders, including figures like Wolfgang Templin and Bärbel Boly, would later play a key role in the events that unfolded. Meanwhile, the East German economy continued its downward spiral, with shortages of basic goods and services becoming ever more acute. The government's attempts to reform the economy, such as the introduction of the new economic system in 1968, only seemed to exacerbate the problems, leading to widespread disillusionment among the population. As the economic situation deteriorated, the flow of refugees attempting to flee to the West continued, with many making daring escapes across the border or through third countries like Hungary and Czechoslovakia. In the midst of this growing unrest, a new leader emerged in the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, who would soon introduce reforms that would shake the very foundations of the communist system. Gorbachev's policies of glasnost and perestroika, introduced in the mid-1980s, aimed to increase transparency and accountability within the Soviet government, while also liberalizing the economy and encouraging private enterprise. As these reforms took hold, they had a profound impact on Eastern Europe, emboldening dissident movements and weakening the grip of communist regimes. In East Germany, the effects of Gorbachev's reforms were particularly pronounced, with the government facing growing pressure to introduce similar reforms. In 1987, the East German leader Erich Honecker visited West Germany, where he was met with widespread protests and demonstrations, further undermining his already tenuous position. As the situation continued to deteriorate, the East German government found itself increasingly isolated, both domestically and internationally, with its own people turning against it and its allies in the Soviet Union pushing for reform. As the East German government struggled to maintain its grip on power, the influence of Gorbachev's reforms continued to spread throughout Eastern Europe. In Poland, the Solidarity movement, led by Lech Walesa, had already begun to challenge the communist regime, and in Hungary, a growing reform movement was pushing for greater liberalization. The East German government, aware of these developments, grew increasingly isolated and paranoid, with Honecker's leadership facing mounting criticism from within the party. In May 1989, the East German government held local elections, which were widely seen as a test of its legitimacy. However, the elections were marred by widespread irregularities and vote rigging, leading to accusations of fraud and further eroding trust in the government. The opposition, meanwhile, had begun to organize more openly, with groups like the Initiative for Peace and Human Rights and the Democratic Awakening movement holding public demonstrations and rallies. One such event took place on June 17, 1989, when a group of dissidents gathered in front of the East Berlin Cathedral to protest against the government's repression. The protest was peaceful, but it marked a significant escalation in the opposition's tactics as they began to challenge the government more directly. The authorities responded with force, arresting several protesters and beating others, but the event had already sparked a sense of momentum among the opposition. As the summer of 1989 wore on, the East German government faced growing unrest along its borders. In July, a group of East Germans had begun to occupy the West German embassy in Prague, seeking asylum and escape from the communist regime. The occupation was eventually ended through negotiations, but it marked a significant turning point, as thousands of East Germans began to flock to the embassy, hoping to escape to the West. The Hungarian government, meanwhile, had begun to dismantle its border fence with Austria, creating a hole in the Iron Curtain and allowing East Germans to flee to the West. On September 11, 1989, Hungary's foreign minister, Gyula Horn, announced that his country would no longer prevent East Germans from leaving for the West, effectively opening the border. The news sparked a mass exodus, as thousands of East Germans made their way to Hungary and then on to Austria, seeking freedom and a new life in the West. As the East German government struggled to respond to this crisis, its leadership was thrown into disarray. On September 18, 1989, Günter Schabowski, a member of the Politburo, announced that the government would allow East Germans to travel directly to the West, effective immediately. The announcement sparked jubilation among those seeking to flee, but it also marked a point of no return for the East German regime as its control over the population began to crumble. In the weeks that followed, the East German government's authority continued to erode as protests and demonstrations grew in size and intensity. On October 7, 1989, Gorbachev visited East Berlin to mark the 40th anniversary of the founding of the German Democratic Republic, but his presence only served to further undermine Honecker's leadership. As the Soviet leader spoke of reform and glasnost, the East German crowds responded with chants of "Gorby, Gorby," highlighting their desire for change and their rejection of the communist regime. As Gorbachev's visit came to a close, the East German government's situation continued to deteriorate. On October 9, 1989, a massive protest took place in Leipzig, with estimates suggesting that up to 70,000 people gathered to demand reform and an end to the communist regime. The Leipzig protest marked a turning point in the crisis, as it showed that the opposition was now strong enough to organize large-scale demonstrations without fear of reprisal. Over the next few days, similar protests took place in other cities across East Germany, including Dresden, Magdeburg, and Berlin. The government, struggling to respond to the growing unrest, announced a series of concessions, including the resignation of several high-ranking officials and the promise of free elections. On October 18, 1989, Günter Schabowski, the same Politburo member who had announced the travel reforms earlier in the month, replaced Günther Mittag as the government's secretary for economics. Schabowski's appointment was seen as an attempt to appease the protesters and reformers within the party, but it ultimately proved too little, too late. The opposition, now emboldened by their successes on the streets, began to demand more radical changes, including the resignation of Honecker and the dissolution of the communist government. As the protests continued to grow in size and intensity, the East German government's control over the country began to break down. On October 23, 1989, a group of protesters in Berlin attempted to storm the headquarters of the Socialist Unity Party (SED), but were repelled by security forces. The incident marked a rare instance of violence during the protests, but it also highlighted the growing desperation and frustration among the opposition. In the midst of this chaos, a new figure emerged as a leader of the opposition: Jens Reich, a 36-year-old physician from East Berlin. Reich, who had been involved in the dissident movement for several years, became one of the key organizers of the protests in Berlin, using his charisma and communication skills to rally the crowds and coordinate the demonstrations. Along with other prominent activists, such as Barbel Boly and Ibrahim Bomi, Reich played a crucial role in shaping the opposition's strategy and pushing for more radical reforms. As November 1989 began, the East German government was on the brink of collapse. The protests showed no signs of abating, and the economy was in shambles. On November 1, 1989, the government announced a new travel law, which would allow East Germans to visit the West without prior permission. However, the move came too late to stem the tide of emigration, as thousands of people had already fled to the West to Hungary and Czechoslovakia. On November 4, 1989, a massive protest took place in East Berlin's Alexanderplatz, with estimates suggesting that up to 1 million people attended. The demonstration, which was organized by Reich and other opposition leaders, marked one of the largest and most significant protests in East German history. The crowd, waving banners and chanting slogans, demanded an end to the communist regime and the establishment of a democratic government. As the protesters marched through the city, they were met with a mixture of applause and curiosity from onlookers. Many East Germans, who had previously been too afraid to speak out against the government, now felt emboldened to join the protests and demand change. The atmosphere was electric, with a sense of excitement and anticipation hanging in the air. The Alexanderplatz protest marked a decisive moment in the crisis, as it showed that the opposition had become a mass movement capable of mobilizing hundreds of thousands of people. The government, realizing that it could no longer control the situation, began to crumble from within. On November 7, 1989, the entire Politburo resigned, and Honecker was replaced by Egon Krenz, a relatively unknown figure who had previously served as the party's secretary for security affairs. Krenz, who attempted to portray himself as a reformer, announced a series of concessions, including the establishment of a new government and the promise of free elections. However, his efforts were too little, too late, and the opposition continued to push for more radical changes. On November 9, 1989, Günter Schabowski, now the government's de facto spokesperson, held a press conference in which he announced that the East German government would allow East Germans to travel directly to the West, effective immediately. As Schabowski spoke, a crowd of journalists and cameras packed into the room, eager to hear the latest developments. The atmosphere was tense, with a sense of anticipation hanging in the air. Schabowski's announcement sparked a flurry of questions and comments as the assembled journalists struggled to understand the implications of the government's decision. The consequences of Schabowski's announcement were almost immediate. As news of the travel reforms spread, thousands of East Germans gathered at the Berlin Wall, demanding that the border guards open the gates. The guards, unsure of what to do, eventually relented, and the crowd surged through the wall, cheering and crying as they made their way into West Berlin. The fall of the Berlin Wall marked a historic moment, not just for Germany, but for the world. As the news spread, people from across the globe watched in awe as the physical and symbolic divide between East and West was torn down. The event marked the beginning of a new era of freedom and democracy, not just for Germany, but for the entire region. In the days and weeks that followed, the East German government continued to crumble as the opposition pushed for more radical reforms. On December 1, 1989, the East German parliament voted to remove the Communist Party's monopoly on power, paving the way for free elections and a transition to democracy. The move marked a decisive moment in the country's history, as it signaled the end of communism and the beginning of a new era of freedom and prosperity. On December 7, 1989, the East German government, now led by Egon Krenz, announced that free elections would be held on March 18, 1990. The news sparked widespread excitement and anticipation among the East German population, who saw this as an opportunity to shape their country's future. In the weeks leading up to the election, a range of political parties emerged, including the Social Democratic Party, SPD, the Christian Democratic Union, CDU, and the Alliance for Germany. These parties campaigned on platforms promising democratic reform, economic liberalization, and reunification with West Germany. The East German people, eager for change, flocked to these new parties, abandoning the Communist Party in droves. On March 18, 1990, East Germans went to the polls in their first free election since 1933. The turnout was high, with over 93% of eligible voters participating. The results were a resounding rejection of communism, with the Alliance for Germany winning 48.1% of the vote, followed by the SPD with 21.9% and the CDU with 16.4%. The Communist Party, now rebranded as the Party of Democratic Socialism, PDS, won just 16.4% of the vote. The newly elected parliament, known as the Volkskammer, convened on April 5, 1990. Sabine Bergmann-Pohl, a CDU politician, was elected as the first female president of the Volkskammer. The new government, led by Lothar de Maizière, a CDU politician, set about implementing democratic reforms and preparing for reunification with West Germany. As East Germany transitioned to democracy, the country's economy began to open up to the West. On July 1, 1990, the East German mark was replaced by the Deutsche Mark, West Germany's currency. This move marked a significant step towards economic reunification and paved the way for the eventual merger of the two countries' economies. On August 23, 1990, the Volkskammer voted to dissolve itself and hold new elections in December. The decision marked a key milestone on the path to reunification, as it cleared the way for East Germany's accession to the Federal Republic of Germany. On October 3, 1990, East and West Germany were officially reunited, bringing an end to decades of division. The reunification ceremony, held at the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin, was attended by dignitaries from around the world, including West German Chancellor Helmut Kohl, East German Prime Minister Lothar de Maizière, and U.S. Secretary of State James Baker. As the clock struck midnight, the black, red, and gold flag of a unified Germany was raised, marking the beginning of a new era for the country. In the months and years that followed, Germany worked to rebuild and reunify its economy, infrastructure, and society. The process was not without challenges, as East Germans struggled to adapt to the free market economy and West Germans grappled with the costs of reunification. However, through determination and hard work, Germany emerged stronger and more united than ever before. The fall of the Berlin Wall and the reunification of Germany marked a triumphant end to decades of division and oppression. As the people of Germany looked to the future, they knew that their country would never again be divided by walls or ideology. The legacy of the Berlin Wall would live on as a powerful symbol of the human desire for freedom and unity. The fall of the Berlin Wall marked a seismic shift in modern history, toppling the physical and ideological barriers that had divided a nation and a world for decades. As the dust settled on that fateful night, the course of human events was forever altered, ushering in an era of unprecedented freedom, unity, and global interconnectedness. The Berlin Wall's collapse serves as a powerful testament to the indomitable human spirit, which can move mountains, breach walls, and bring down empires in pursuit of liberty, justice, and the unrelenting quest for a better tomorrow. The wall may be gone, but its legacy remains a potent symbol of the transformative power of courage, resilience, and the unwavering commitment to a common humanity. Thank you for joining me throughout this historical journey. Remember to like, share, and subscribe. And until next time, remember that, to understand the present, we must first understand the past.